one really key thing here is blockchains in general are highly, they're like large systems, they're complex systems, they involve lots of different components, and so you end up in a situation where you have to get many different things to work well together, and so changing them is difficult, but you want to sort of be able to kind of improve many different parts over time, and you kind of want to improve each one of these segments simultaneously. I tend to think about it kind of like in a spiral, where you want to get each one of these things working well enough, and then keep iterating across and keep improving things. Over time, more and more groups start attacking different parts here and just expanding it. But really think of like the whole large-scale ecosystem that the cloud systems have developed around their facilities. And think of facilities like that being developed in the decentralized cloud ecosystem. And one of the key components here is, as we all know in the Falcon community, data has gravity. So when you know very clearly how difficult it is to get tons of drives and tons of data into specific locations. Once you do that, it is much harder to sort of move it around. It's much easier and cheaper to deploy computational hardware and computing and the functions and so on that you're going to run to the data than to move around the data. So think of Filecoin over the next over the first few years of its life, accumulating tons of really valuable data, especially public data commons and things like that, and then building a large-scale open permissionless cloud where you can run any kind of computing system on top of that. And so I'll get into this a little bit later, but this is a really good L1 for decentralized computing networks to be able to do large-scale computation. Cool. So it's kind of amazing to see these kinds of stats. Just the 16 exabyte figure, which is probably outdated at this point because this was like a week or two ago, is truly an enormous amount of storage capacity. And that shows just the massive power that you get out of an open, permissionless, decentralized network with incentive structures and with a large community of participants creating this value together. So whenever we have some like large-scale problem, if you can think of solving it with game theory, with mechanism design, with incentive structures, with permissionlessness, with open systems, you can get certain scale way faster than many kind of centralized approaches. So I'm sure that right now all of you are encountering all kinds of programs and systems that you're designing and building and so on, and you're just falling into the same typical structure of doing things where you're going to create a program yourself and you're going to run it and you're going to kind of do the coordination yourself and you're going to get email and you're going to respond to email and so on. And if you instead kind of shift it to some kind of open permissionless structure where you coordinate very publicly, you can get a much more impact and much faster. So I really encourage you to be thinking about designing systems that are, and designing your programs to be open, permissionless, and community-oriented. One of the probably most important things here is just the number of organizations and contributors and so on just continuing to increase. Yeah. This is the map that I've been using relatively recently to map the Filecoin system. This is kind of the current state. Over time, this might evolve and change and so on. But I want to maybe describe sort of like why it's structured this way. Think of storage clients as wanting to gather data to SPs and then want to retrieve the data out. Different kinds of verticals and different kinds of systems need a bunch of tools dedicated to that vertical. So think of NFT-to-storage as an example. NFT-to-storage is a really useful tool for NFT creators and NFT builders and so on. And being able to tune the product experience, being able to tune the interfaces, the branding, the messaging, the developer libraries, the tutorials, all of that to that specific vertical makes it way easier to achieve product market fit in that particular vertical and be able to build the main product that everyone will use to onboard their data. So think of these like on-ramps and aggregators developing for different kinds of verticals, different kinds of systems. And right now we have a very few. Like there are many different kinds of verticals that can leverage this type of strategy. So I'll touch on it a little bit more in a bit. Now that one really big one that's missing is like large-scale data onboarding. We need some kind of on-ramp I'll touch on it a bit more later. But we need some kind of on-ramp to be able to move around large-scale data sets. So think of petabytes at a time and so on. Like we've quickly vaulted into that level of need, and that's a pretty awesome place to be. But it'd be great to kind of problem solve against that and just enable the community to kind of create that. My sense is there's a very good business there. That's a potential for SPs in different locations to create kind of like a sort of like a data shuttle service potentially. Can dig into a little bit more later. Actually, before going in, we heard about the indexers. Just think of that as the main way to address all of the content that's being added. And over time, think of getting and developing different views on the data. So right now, there's a bunch of data sets bundled into car files, stored in sectors, and so on. And it's difficult to like walk the data structures and navigate that. But that's where IPLD and IPFS and so on have been designed to enable you to create different views over all of that data without duplicating. So you're able to kind of just add indexing information around the data as it's stored right there to be able to add different ways of pulling all of those data structures. So right now we're kind of indexing just the data structures that are inside of the car files. But later think of being able to run a process that takes a different view or like indexes the data differently, generates some other data structures, and then you can index those and provide access to those. So think of being able to build databases on top of all of this. And being able to build specific kinds of specific use cases on top of it without having to duplicate the data again. A lot of the data sets that especially larger scale ones in scientific use cases, tend to have all these very specific formats, and that's a great area to kind of think of. Like you first just get the data as it is, it doesn't matter. You onboard it, and then later you add these other views that can slice the data and look at it in different ways. So it's okay that right now a lot of the data is kind of like just bundled together and it's hard to like get out. It's hard to like make useful. All of that can be solved with intermediate data structures that give access to that material. We need a lot of developers to start doing that kind of work, but it'll be very much driven by demand use cases. So if we find specific verticals where there's specific types of data sets that people want to compute with, that'll be like really good fodder to then develop all these kinds of indexing tools and so on. One that I keep hearing about is like geospatial data. So like you have like all this constantly changing large scale, large resolution data that you want to onboard. And that's a perfect one to be able to develop all kinds of tools and applications on top of. Right now there's so then the next thing there is, actually maybe I'll comment once more on the indexers. No, I'll get to it later. And then the retrieval providers are a way to kind of pull the data really quickly. We'll dig into this a little bit more. But the important thing there is that you want to be able to deal with two main problems. One is speed of light. You want to get the data to be served ideally locally. You want the hot data to be very close to the end user. And the second one is just bandwidth. When you have millions or hundreds of millions of requests coming at some piece of data, you need the set of machines capable of dealing with that incoming bandwidth. And so that's where retrieval providers can be like this amazing cache layer over all of this data. Cool. So by the way, it's really awesome that we years and years ago we imagined this and it's real now and super cool. So huge congratulations to all of you. One of the coolest things in this graph is the recovery, right? We had that big failure of a mysterious data center that caught fire. Maybe did. I never heard, by the way. Do we know if it really caught fire, or was that never resolved? We're never going to know. But being able to recover all of that and then get on the fast path with Falcon Plus was really, really cool. That shows kind of a data storage network in action. This is actually very surprising to me. I would have expected us to see many more Jaggies or things falling and then recovering. And it's really awesome that our reliability, the verifiability of the data is so good that hasn't happened much, if at all. Yeah, so this is really massive scale. and there's all kinds of things that are super interesting to point out. Like when you compare this to the Bitcoin network, when you have significant volatility in the Bitcoin price, or you have like large policy changes, usually you can see that in the hash rate, and the hash rate responds to it very significantly. And lots of and in the storage network, it's really critical that you don't like lose data, people's data, right? Losing hash power is one thing. Losing people's data is a whole different thing. And so it's really awesome that the whole model incentive structures designed into Filecoin are working to be able to kind of deal with those stresses and absorb those shocks in the network. And it's like really, really great indicator that the network is super strong. And like Wally was saying, here's like a view into how much more capacity we can have. So like I would imagine, we have to get like the actual, it would be great to have like a graph that shows the watermark, but we have an enormous amount of capacity in the aggregation. So think of as like more gas usage comes in through FVM and other things, more and more of the storage proofs get pulled into the aggregation channel, and then that can go like much faster. So I wouldn't expect us to be rate limited by bandwidth on the chain for quite a while, unless there were like a specific application that just used direct transactions on the chain.
Someone puts a deals market that puts every deal on chain, every retrieval deal on chain in a FVM smart contract, we might get there. But like.
Yeah, we over-designed against that, and maybe we should just start it that way. It would have been easier and faster, and then solved it later. Great, so this is an awesome graph that just shows the changes in population for SPs across different scales. And probably one of the coolest things is just how those ribbons, this probably like can be ordered a little bit different. It's kind of a little bit hard to follow, but what those entry point ribbons show is SPs graduating from one size to another size. This isn't deduplicated by entity, so this is each minor actor on the chain and their sizes. But it shows like those ribbons growing show the number of specific SPs growing to that scale. This is not weighted by storage size, so the little lines at the very bottom, those are like the mega minor actors that have 50 plus petabytes. So if this was weighted by size, it would probably look different. We should probably make a graph like that. But yeah, this is really, really cool to see. Like even throughout like the last year of stresses with all the China policy changes, it's amazing to see this growth happening across the world. Yeah, I think, raise your hand if you participated in the ESPA program, just so I get a sample. Awesome. Were you, was that like your first entry point, or were you mentors, or did you put it on? Can I hear from people? Gotta warm the room up.
Who all was mentors? Who all was participating?
Great, awesome. Can I hear some like highlights of like what was like the coolest thing that you learned there or that you found there? Couple people. Yeah.
I work on the business side, but during ESPA, I had a chance to attend the business and the tax track and actually learn something. Because our company doesn't have like a group of people who just advocate business, which I think the resource there is very helpful.
Yeah. Thank you.
And also for tech people to learn some business, learn about it, economy.
Yep.
Yeah, which is great. Yeah.
It's great.
But I hope the EXPA people get to introduce to each other.
Yeah, that'd be really cool. It'd be awesome to have like a video reel of like interviewing all the participants that went through and kind of hearing about it. It's awesome to see the talks online. There's like the bootcamp version on YouTube, and that's fascinating, really useful knowledge. So thank you for putting that together. Any other comments?
Yeah, just the scale of the community, really, and the amount of support you can get from anyone. Just walk up to anyone, ask a question, and then it's a half an hour conversation. It's great.
Yeah, that's awesome. Any last sticker? Yeah, right there.
Hi, everyone. Michael Fair. So I am with Pitnik, and I really run the recruiting side of ESPA. So if anyone here is interested in attending one of the future cohorts, either in July or in October, please let me know.
Awesome.
Yeah.
And thank you for running this. Super useful. So yeah, opportunities for folks. Attend those cohorts. Bring your services. If you're an SP or an ecosystem provider that has some service that could be useful to SPs, ESPA is a great channel for you to kind of talk about what you're doing and so on, get talks recorded about your tech, and broadcast it out to the community. So think of bringing your services to those systems. And then think of starting, I don't think ESPA is quite doing any kind of chapter thing yet, but this might be like a really good idea of being able to expand that kind of program to different locations in the world. Being able to kind of think of a chapter style structure if you're an SP that has developed a lot of knowledge about how to run these systems and have like access to extra facilities or something like that. This could be like a really, really useful side business along the way to be able to kind of train other SPs in the area and so on. Great. So I think I'll get to this a little bit later, but just kind of quick comment. I think in terms of features and focus, SPs should be really focusing on excellent onboarding of data right now. So that's there's a bunch of bottlenecks in just kind of, there's a lot of clients interested in pulling in tens of petabytes at a time, and just being able to deal with that onboarding requirement is pretty important. So being able to provide really good handholding of that data, good like customer UX, and then have good retrieval speeds for that data. So once you get the data and you onboard it and so on, being able to have useful, good retrieval speeds will matter, so that then retrieval networks can work on top of that, and applications can work on top of that, and so on. The other thing, there was a survey, I think, for data center links. I think upgrading the links might be really valuable. I don't know how much of this is an issue for SPs here, but I heard that many SPs have like a 1 gigabit per second line, especially the large ones probably want to upgrade, because that'll enable them to get a ton more data. So there's, at the moment, a lot of data in the wings that wants to get into Filecoin, but they're having trouble just kind of, they don't know who to talk to necessarily, or they are following some pilot, but it's kind of slow. And so being able to kind of greatly accelerate the onboarding rate of the network would be really great. And a lot of this can come through offline data onboarding as well. So both either increasing the capacity of the links or having a pretty good way of accepting offline data. The other part is business-wise, given like the macro, we'll talk about this more later, but given the macro econ condition right now, two things matter here. One is stable operations, so really manage cash flows well. In an econ downturn, when you don't know how long it's going to last, and where a lot of the people are saying, "Oh, long-term recovery, it could be a year, it could be 2 years," you want to be able to like really manage cash flows well and make sure that you're like in a really well positioned for survival. Separate from that, this is related opportunity for SP funds. I would sort of expect a number of SP funds to emerge that are going to provide investments to storage providers over the next year or two. But don't count on those. Raising money in this time period will be hard. The second thing is, in every downturn, this tends to be an amazing opportunity for those that are really well prepared. This can be a great time for growth. This can be a great time to optimize operations, and so on. So the crypto community has been learning through all kinds of, it's very volatile and cyclical, which is really useful to like, in those downturn moments, focus on growth, focus on leveling up operations, and be well poised for shifts. So, but again, P0 is like stable operations. Make sure you and your org are like really well set up, and then separate, like think of what opportunities are now available to you, and orient towards that. And if you find like good side businesses, that's an SP, you develop some expertise in something, or like you can help other groups, that's a great opportunity for a side business. And so think of doing that. Think of like leaning into kind of added services or different like tiers of service or things like that. Great. I'll touch a little bit about retrieval providers. So I know this is what a lot of people want. Here's a view into the IPFS gateway data streams. So this is like, I think 1 billion requests per week and growing, which is, this is only the single gateway that PL runs, the PL Starfleet runs. There's other IPFS gateways out there. And so ideally, a lot of this can just be served by the Filecoin retrieval networks once they come online. And this, I think, is like 8 million people per week, different users per week requesting things. And so as more and more applications come in, that'll keep growing. it's also the case that when there are like big spikes and there's some application that like consumes a ton of bandwidth, they tend to get kicked out and like told to go to set up their own gateway or set up some other service. So it'd be great to like get visibility into all of the gateways or all the applications and how much traffic that is. But over time, this will accumulate to a lot. Good opportunities. So devs build retrieval provider networks that beats the gateway perf. This is where Saturn, Mail, and a number of others are working. And for SPs, like make your content available through those indexers. So the indexer that Brenda mentioned, you want to get your content indexed by that to then start getting retrieval requests. The retrieval provider networks are going to lean on that indexer to know which SPs to go to ask for what content. So you want to like advertise your content there, then retrieval provider networks can like connect through that. And as was mentioned, like definitely talk to Patrick about the broader set of projects. There's a lot of stuff going on. Many different things are coming together. Some like really cool highlights include I think which one is this one? Is it here? There's like a really cool payment channel network already working, and that's super exciting. Titan? Magma, that's right. So that's a maybe I don't have it here. Oh, I see. Go naturally. I see it now. And then the Pando is also really cool, where it's just kind of become this really useful metadata service to just dump all kinds of important artifacts that you need to run other protocols. So opportunities for devs, join one of these retrieval network projects, start your own. There are grants for all of this, and try out some of the early RP software. So talk to Ansgar from the Saturn team, talk to the Mile folks, talk to Titan and others. And I think like here, I think things are getting ready to deploy these networks. I think there is a lot of data. There are many data sets through those aggregators that want to find high throughput, low latency delivery. But what really matters there is to have like a good end-to-end structure where the sets of clients that are going to request the data can go to RPs that are in their region, and those RPs can find the content through indexers and can talk to SPs that have the content. And you want the latency across those jumps to be pretty good. Like you don't want the latency from one RP to an SP to be like more than a second. Like a second is probably fine in a cache miss, but like you don't want it to be much more than that. It could be like 2-3 seconds might be okay, but if it's like 10 seconds, that doesn't work. That might work for some kinds of data sets where you preload the data, but we'll have to figure out what tends to work better. And my expectation is that we'll end up developing different approaches, and then we'll test them out in production, and then one of these approaches will work way better, and we'll sort of learn that over time. Follow with the retrieval market demo days. There's tons of really cool stuff that's being built. One really great thing is like that dashboard. It's going to start measuring all the different retrieval provider networks and how well they work across a variety of features. So you can tell from that like how well the network is evolving. Cool, content indexing. A lot of opportunities here. So one is a lot of opportunities around the DHT lookup processes and so on. There's a lot of data that's being served through IPFS through the DHT. Over time, some amount of that can then start hitting RPs and SPs. But the more exciting thing is the network indexer and really getting all of your content there. I think right now, how many source providers are being indexed right now? Do we know? 100 plus. All right, awesome. And how much data? 9 billion records. And how many bytes does that represent?
2 terabytes.
2 terabytes only. Cool. So we have a lot more data to get. I hear there's 80 petabytes waiting to get indexed somewhere. Oh, 2 terabytes of the index. Got it. How much data does that represent that's stored somewhere else? Do we know? Sorry to put you on the spot.
What was the question? Oh, how much percentage of data has been indexed? Yeah, I'm not sure about that part.
Cool.
Check, yeah.
We should. It'd be awesome to get a graph where we can see that, so we can see like that graph of index data catching up to the total amount of data on the network, and eventually get to like 100%.
Yeah.
Yeah, so ideally, we want to get the latency here to be able to figure out who has what, to be super fast, like to be kind of on the range of like 10 milliseconds when you're within the same data center or the same region, and so around 100 milliseconds if you're not in the same data center. And that's what's going to enable really fast retrieval, because you first have to do a lookup, figure out who's got the content, and then from there, go. So retrieval networks are going to be huge users of this, both like to figure out what SPs to go to, and what and between themselves, like to be able to pull the data and cache it better. So yes, opportunities, get your content index, and so on. Storage clients. So I think this is where this is probably the most, for me, like the most exciting area at the moment and for growth. Getting to a point where we can bring that graph on the bottom to a much higher spot. Like that's kind of where a lot of our focus should be. And translating a lot of the client pilots that are interested in bringing data onto the network into successful data onboarding, deals on chain, and with good retrievability. And once we start doing that, then we can start building applications on top and all that kind of stuff. This is like awesome, super fast growth. We should feel super proud that this kind of onboarding rate is like both enormous in size. This is much larger than many successful centralized storage companies. Not the biggest ones, of course, but there are many centralized storage companies who built like very significant businesses storing a much smaller amount of data. So that's like a really great success so far. We have a lot of room to store stuff, so there's tons of capacity to keep going. We want to onboard tons of really useful data, and especially put an emphasis on public data that can be then used for all kinds of permissionless applications. If you onboard a lot of public data sets, and then you then have hackathons on top of that, you can make that data way more useful. If you need to run large computational pipelines, that's when we start hitting into the computational networks around the data stored in the SPs. But to get there, we got to focus on data onboarding rate. So first of all, like we're in a really good trajectory, and it's growing quite a bit. I think we need to get this to about like 5 petabytes a day, which is a lot, granted. But that's sort of like where the network wants to be, and can go into more detail there later. And we might end up discussing this more in the Crypto Econ Day if people are interested. And this is the fastest growing decentralized storage network by far. This is much closer to some of the large scale centralized storage networks. Lots of opportunities around this. So sourcing more and more clients, leverage the success case here. Point out, like, we should get more intel over what data sets this onboarding represents, what customers are flowing in, what data sets are now stored, to then be able to like use those as reference clients with many other clients, and have like a whole BD cycle of being able to kind of like approach new prospective clients with really good success case stories and so on. And this is areas where like if you have had like really good experiences onboarding large scale clients, think of like single petabytes or more. Those might make great customer success stories and test case survey. What are they called? Case studies. That's the one. And so being able to kind of write about those, record video about those, push that stuff out there, that'll help generate a lot more participation, right? So right now, tons of people around the world are paying huge sums of money to back up data that we could be backing up for them dramatically cheaper. They just don't know about it. They don't know about it. Or even if they know about it, they don't know how to use it. Or if they try to use it, they like they don't know how to like explore it and so on. And so we have to like now cross that chasm and get a lot of people to understand what the potential is, what the value is, and make sure that they have a really, really good experience. Something we haven't done is figure out like some algorithm for detecting really good customer success. So think of like, we probably need some kind of coordination mechanism where we can track clients as they get interested in Filecoin, and we can track the life cycle of that relationship and see where they had successes, where they had failures, because we'll get a ton of feedback from that. Right now, all of us are sort of doing that independently in different parts. Like various groups have their own individual sort of like funnels in a sense. But if we found a coordination mechanism to integrate that information, that would be super, super helpful, because then we can spot like, oh, this type of client tends to run into this kind of problem. There's either a software tool that needs to be built there or a service that needs to be built there, or hey, actually, these particular SPs tend to handle that kind of thing super well. Let's flow more of that business to those groups. And so coming up with like a good tool here to coordinate that, I think would be super useful. And then kind of in terms of increasing onboarding rate, so I think one part is like bigger pipes, so upgrading the connectivity. And the other part is offline onboarding. So that means like just the Snowball or data-heavy, Databox-heavy equivalents. Like we need to be able to like show up a facility with like petabytes of capacity or a petabyte of capacity, onboard the data really fast, and then take it to an SP. And that, I think, is a great like business for that SPs could run, right? So like there's usually a lot of SPs in some region. One of you, if you get experience and expertise over doing this, can sell that as a service, as a side business to other SPs that want to onboard that data. And I think like that could be really compelling. Bandwidth, like moving data is expensive. So figuring out a good way to do that, you can probably like price it pretty well and that, get a significant margin there. I think there are like hundreds of like large-scale data sets. A lot of other people probably have talked about a lot of this. I think there's lots of really cool, exciting use cases where these large-scale clients are interested in storing copies with Filecoin, and they're testing out the network. And think of this year and next year, and maybe even the year after, for many large-scale clients, as really important crucible years where they're going to test out the network and they're going to get a feel for the capabilities. And those are like both really good opportunities to get really amazing customers, but then lean into features that the centralized cloud providers just can't do. So things like the verifiability of the proofs, things like being able to attest where exactly the data is, certain kinds of other constraints, being able to, I think this is where certain cryptographic techniques to store the data encrypted, like fully homomorphic encryption or MPC and so on, might be super, super, super useful. And those might be edges against what the centralized cloud providers can't do. But then think of like these large customers that want to store vast amounts of data, are really kind of like paying very close attention to those first few pilots that they do, and they want to get a sense of like how good is this going to be, and they're going to make a lot of decisions for years based on like how good that experience is. So as a community, we want to make sure that those experiences go really well. I want to kind of highlight this use case, which is I think super, super cool. Having these public archives of important civic data sets that have a commons-oriented use case. This is one of the things that centralized cloud providers can't do very well, but decentralized networks are perfect for, because you have data sovereignty baked into the system. You can onboard these super precious, valuable data sets for large-scale communities. These tend to be, in some cases, huge data sets that are really expensive to store and maintain and so on, and you want to run lots of computation over. And you want to be able to store them in a public, permissionless environment where people can, where like the community that cares about that data set could run these kinds of things. Raise your hand if you've heard about the data DAO concept. A few, cool. So the idea here is like data sets tend to map to specific applications or communities or groups that are curating, maintaining, and deciding how to use specific data. And this is where like the coordination tooling of DAOs can be extremely useful. You can think of building a DAO for archivists or people that are cleaning up data and transforming it and so on, and then deciding how the data should be used, and then leaning on top of Filecoin. The piece we're missing is FVM to be able to run those kinds of things, though even right now people could probably prototype this all and run it on Ethereum. But then being able to kind of like then decide what monetization pathways can happen over the data can make those data DAOs super successful as well. So you can have like a data DAO that curates really valuable information and then decide how that data should be monetized and so on. When initially starting Filecoin, I talked to a lot of large-scale data users. Some of them were like these massive corporations that generate massive scale data sets for telemetry over the Earth. So think of like telemetry of the ground, telemetry of like the atmosphere, telemetry of all kinds of factors about the Earth or a city or like all the plants and so on. And right now, all of that data is like super, super difficult to use. It's not well organized, not well, it's not searchable at all, hard to compute against and so on. And it is inherently complex in terms of a sovereignty and governance standpoint. Because this is usually public data, it has a public commons orientation, and it has privacy constraints. You can't just kind of reveal what the entire grid of a city looks like. However, it is perfectly the model to run kind of verifiable computation over it, where you can ship a function that is only looking at certain things, we can tell what the output is going to be. And so these kinds of like civic data sets are super promising for a network like this, where centralized providers just like aren't very good at this. And this could be like a use case that really shines on these networks. And those data sets tend to be enormous, and they get bigger and bigger and bigger over time because people build better and better tooling that give you better resolution, or you need to track it over time, and so on. There's like so kind of like Landsat as like one specific case. Think of much higher resolution imagery across many different kind of sensors for like every square meter of the Earth and deep into the ground. All of that data can add up to hundreds of petabytes and needs to be generated, stored, archived, carefully curated, and carefully managed in terms of the life cycle. So I think it's going to be like a pretty big deal. My sense on the timing on this is like all of these data DAOs are probably going to start hitting next year. And I think the prototypes are going to happen later this year and early next year. And so if there are specific data sets like this that could be really useful to prototype as an early use case, shine light on that, show what's possible, tell the world about it, and then within 3 to 4 months, you see a lot more participants doing it, right? So think of it kind of like DeFi or NFTs or something like that. You want some early use cases, show that it works, how it works, what the potential is, and then you usually generate a lot more activity later. And so yeah, there's a ton of like data sets that we're doing really well in terms of onboarding, and many more that kind of can follow this. I think it would be awesome to be able to kind of replicate the Internet Archive fully. I think we have the space for it. We just have to figure out how to move the data. Right now, it's like I think stuck on a movement of data problem of like how do you move this large scale data around to what SPs around the world and so on. So there's like a really good opportunity. Slingshot has been really successful at pulling together a bunch of data sets, but now we have to make them useful. So we have the data, great. Now we got to make it programmable, and this is where all this kind of indexing over it, different applications and so on can come in. So yeah, and right now in terms of like the feature set, archival is like the perfect use case. Over time, as retrievability gets really good, as indexing gets really good, as programmability of the being able to run functions against the data and so on, then it sort of opens up a bunch of other use cases. But right now, think of like archiving really large public data as like a really nice sweet spot. Onboarding those large-scale use cases will then enable you to then offer all kinds of computation over those use cases later. So you can sort of like approach it as an archival use case first. Oh, and then, by the way, like now we have computing over all of this and so on. Cool. So storage on-ramps. And by the way, a lot of this data is probably outdated, but huge success through NFT storage. Like this model of finding a very specific onboarding pathway, designing a product tuned to that use case, so that get really good product market fit, have the documentation, the branding, the messaging, the SLAs, everything very well tuned to achieve product market fit in that particular vertical is a great strategy. And I think this can apply to all kinds of other verticals. It's great to see it grow a ton. Over time, this stuff is going to start including much larger NFTs. So think of video. Video NFTs are like still coming. They haven't quite hit the market. And then large-scale whole 3D spaces and 3D rooms and games and so on. So think of all of those use cases as flowing into these kinds of onboarding pathways. Yeah, Web3 those stories is the same kind of really awesome success story. And this one tuned more to like more general use cases, but sort of like tuned towards developers. And then yeah, Estuary as well, another really awesome onboarding tool dedicated to larger scale data sets and so on. I don't know exactly what the sweet spot is for Estuary. It might be like tens of gigabytes all the way to like terabytes, but I'm not 100% sure. But it's kind of like maybe having a map that shows all the different on-ramps might be really useful to like know which one to go to. This one recently shipped, which is Big Data Exchange. Is the X here? No, somewhere. So what's really interesting about this is like, right now there's a coordination problem in the whole network where we have massive amount of capacity, and we can store data for super cheap, and we have to like get lots of people to help onboard onto the network, pay a high onboarding cost because they have to learn about the system, they don't know how to do it really well, they have to like deal with a lot of tutorials and so on. And so kind of, I sort of claimed this last year where I think that this is ripe for an auction model. If you put an auction model on there, you can get for a while the storage pricing to go negative. And if in the world storage pricing goes negative, think of that as like an oil price goes negative kind of moment. Like it is super crazy to hear like, oh, you're gonna get paid to take a lot of oil, right? Like isn't oil like one of the most expensive commodities in the world? Like doesn't everyone want oil? Yeah, sometimes in the supply chain and systems, you get into these weird spots where like suddenly the oil price becomes negative. So this is one of these kind of bizarre conditions that's really useful to us if we lean into it, because this can create an environment where the rest of the world suddenly starts pushing tons of data into Filecoin and busting through all kinds of bottlenecks and solving all kinds of developer problems because this becomes the draw. And so this is a way of using incentives to bring lots of data into the network. And once that data is there, data has gravity, then you have the computational networks on top, and then that can be the new home for the data. But you sort of like want to make this kind of like a really successful onboarding pathway. Think of this as kind of like the beginning of DeFi and NFT sort of worked in similar kinds of structures. Huge kudos to the Filecoin Plus folks for like scaling the operation this year. It has been like a huge, awesome thing to see like all of this happening. So quick round of applause for everyone working on this, because this has represented a huge amount of work. And I think like there are some missing on-ramps that we need. So one of them is video. We don't have a really good on-ramp for video right now. And there's tons of video being generated all the time. And this is perfect for Filecoin. So this needs an NFT storage type service. So it's a good opportunity for devs. Same for archives. We don't have a good on-ramp for archives where they have specific tooling requirements. They need tools that like map onto the use cases that they already use, the tool sets that they already have. And so there's another like really valuable missing on-ramp here. And one personal favorite for me is like dev assets. So at the moment, like we have enough capacity to store all of the dev assets that people make and use to like build software. So all of the code on GitHub, all of the package managers, all of the VMs, all of Docker, all of the containers, everything. And by the way, we can do duplicated. So like that's cool too. But we're missing like really good dev on-ramps to make that happen. And unfortunately, devs have the highest of standards for UX. So this is a tricky one, and it's going to need like a really good developer UX thing. But if we make one, then we can. This is a perfect use case because tons of developer assets are exactly a public commons type of problem. Tons of stuff is open source. Tons of people want to be able to have good sovereignty of the data, good governance systems, good governance tooling, and so it's perfect for the Filecoin network. But it sort of needs like a really good developer UX tool on top of it. And then think of like all of the processing that happens over code and VMs and all that kind of stuff, right? Like a huge amount of the data processing in the world is all entirely on top of the data that is used in software systems. And maybe a subset of this might be game assets. Game developer assets might be like a really good one where the assets are bigger and the developer UX requirements are smaller. People need a lower quality. They don't have as high standards for the quality of the UX. So potentially game developer assets might be a very specific on-ramp that like people like, that might be like an entire startup. Cool, so large data on-ramp. So the way that like centralized cloud service providers solve this problem is by building these specific data onboarding systems, these like ruggedized petascale transport things, and they ship you this thing, you like load it up with your data and you ship it back, or they show up with like, there was like a big AWS semi in like one of their like events at some point. Eventually we're gonna get to that scale, but we gotta start somewhere. Azure did the same thing, like they followed the same pathway, found the same problem, solved it in very similar ways. They leaned into building similar kinds of systems. Of these, I'd like encourage you to look at the data box heavy. I think that's a pretty good design. But I think like you can also lean into our friends in Seagate who have like built this entire data system, and like all of this is like ready to go. It just needs like what this needs is just some group of people that can map the clients and SPs in one region and then help figure out the business there of like saying, hey, there's this set of clients, they want to take their data from here to the SPs over here, and they can then schedule think of it as a scheduling problem where you invest in some set of drives here, and then you can shuttle it back and forth and so on. But the really key thing here is super good efficiency in terms of the use of the hardware, because like one extra day of misuse here like is like killer when you're like running very close to the margin. The other thing is really good client UX. So when a group of people shows up at a client facility with a bunch of boxes to take their data, that better go like super smoothly and super good, and that'd be like an amazing experience that those clients are then gonna rave about. And if we do that, then we can get to like a really, really good spot. And I used to think like this might have been solvable with each SP in different area. But I think over time, like given the success of the on-ramps, perhaps there's like a really good business here where like somebody who has experience with all the operations here, could be an SP in an area or something like that, builds a side service like this to help support a lot of the SPs in that region. So in this time of like macro downturn and so on, this is like a potentially really good side business for folks, and it can help with that data onboarding problem. And I would encourage, so like I think all of these groups, like the large, these groups ended up designing their own stuff because they, at the time, these things I think didn't quite exist, or if they existed, they thought they could do like their own thing better and so on. I think there's a lot of development time and cost that's going to go into designing these things. So I would encourage you to either like look at some like consumer hardware-oriented things that you can put together, a simple design, or just like get ready-made things that already work, because the amount of time that you might spend designing a new thing will cost more. So kind of like where we're headed is something like this, where you have storage clients and storage providers and like these like large boxes moving around vast amounts of data. I think this is how we can replicate the archive, the Internet Archive. But it's not going to happen by pumping it through the wires, I don't think, just because like the internet's not fast enough. So if we want to make a bunch of copies of the archive soon, we need a really good data on-ramp like this. This is a really good opportunity for SPs. Cool. So I think there's a lot that has been said about FEM recently. I don't know if here yet, but there's a lot of stuff coming through here. One of the big things here is like you want to get EVM compatibility to enable all the tools that exist in the Ethereum world, and you want to be able to have WASM compatibility because there's all kinds of applications that are going to need to run on top of the data. There's all kinds of legacy systems and even new systems that are going to want to compile their stuff down to WASM and then run it on top of the data. So you want an environment, a developer environment that can tune for that. And the other part is cross-chain calls, like getting that to be work really well from the beginning is a really key piece. There's a lot of stuff going on here, like you can follow the roadmap here. I think right now the good opportunities include, it's primarily for developers, but joining the early developer program, and be able to kind of like ship some of the first Web3 apps. This could also be a good opportunity for people solving large-scale problems across Filecoin using the coordination tooling of smart contracts, right? So you could, this will be very helpful for retrieval provider networks. It'll be very helpful for computational, centralized computation networks. It'll be very, very helpful for other kinds of things like that. I was talking to some of the hardware folks around, so there's this problem in supply chains where sometimes like there's not enough matter, there's not enough atoms of a particular type, so they get really expensive, and you end up having to like recycle and reclaim a lot of the hardware that already exists and that is sort of like tossed. And my guess is that a decentralized network coordinating that supply chain, like that supply chain back from like landfills and trash and discard stuff to like collect all of this, might be like one of the biggest contributions of the Filecoin network to the world. Because like think of like a reverse supply chain here where you're trying to like reuse specific components that are extremely expensive otherwise. And coordination tooling is exactly what blockchains are for. And so instead of like having a slow process with contracts and structures like that, you can get to like public permissionless auctions. And so this is ripe for like a crypto econ team to like design this and then ship an incentive structure into the network, and then people can just like buy particular materials and then just receive them in the mail. So I think that's where like a lot of the stuff is headed. And I keep alluding to this, but you know, so storage, you first get all the storage in place, and then you create an environment for computation around it. And you know, kudos to Charles, because he was one of the first people to like demo a computational tool around data in, I think, Phil, do you guys still run this? Yeah, awesome. Are you getting users? Some? Yeah, so I think like this kind of stuff, like being able to do data analysis and so on over especially large data sets really matters. Most of the tools out there in the SaaS world can't handle large scale data sets. So being able to like do some of this kind of stuff over terabytes or petabytes, like that would be super, super, super cool. And that, like, there's entire massive scale billion-dollar companies designed around just solving a narrow problem like that, like being able to run specific data pipelines over petabytes of data. And like that's so hard to do that many kind of like large-scale companies are just focused on that. Building towards that, I think, could be really valuable. But again, you have to think very carefully about the product market fit here. Like at the end of the day, you need customers to be able to buy the thing. So you have to tune. There's a whole startup or range of startups here of learning how to tune those interfaces to match what those customers want. Recently, there's a whole other talk here, but like decentralized computation, I predict, is not going to be one single network. There's going to be multiple decentralized computation networks. And it's already kind of like trivially true if you look back and see that there's been many projects, but all of them so far want to do everything. And I think that's fraught. I don't think it's going to work. And the reason is that when you have decentralized computation, you have to add verifiability and you have to add confidentiality. And both of those introduce significant performance hits. And it turns out you have different requirements related to verifiability and different requirements related to privacy. In some cases, you're OK with like a weak form of privacy, where like you're OK with a provider like decrypting the data, running the computation, and encrypting it because you trust the provider well enough. In other cases, you might want to use multi-party computation, where you trust a network of computational nodes, even if you don't trust any one of them. Or you might need to lean into something like fully homomorphic encryption. And so once you deal with those cryptographic systems, you add like many orders of magnitude of slowdown. And so that means like it just changes the entire design of these systems. You end up with different protocol schemes, different security properties, different computational complexity, and you end up with like different hardware even. So based on this, my sense is that teams are going to be much more successful by picking a specific technology, mapping that to a specific use case, and building a special case network, moving really fast against that, and then if they're successful there, then translating to building another one, and another one, and another one. And then maybe down the road, somebody could integrate those through really good programming languages and good compilers and so on. But until that happens, I think like for the next couple of years, I think a bunch of decentralized computing networks will emerge. And so what does that mean for Filecoin? Filecoin can be a great L1 to a lot of different decentralized computational networks that can tune for different use cases, that can tune for those different products. And so this is like, huge opportunity here for developers to build one of these things. But for SPs, like, pay attention to these things, because as they arrive and as they emerge, very like value, like you can start running this software and couple it to all of the data on Filecoin, and then this is like a great additional business, right? Where you can get paid for the storage and bandwidth around the data and the computation around it. And then think of all of these computations as producing intermediate artifacts. So like whenever you want to run a function over stuff, you end up generating other incremental stuff. And all of that needs to get stored, at least for some period of time, sometimes forever. So running the computation right there, you don't want to move all the data somewhere else, so where's it going to get stored? Right there with you, right? So this is like really, really good opportunity for all the SPs. So what we should be doing right now is like shipping FEM, so we're on that. Prototyping these kinds of decentralized storage network, decentralized computation networks, and then have really good flows for groups building this stuff. You can follow the Bacalao project, which is kind of working on building a lot of tooling to enable this and has some like really cool demos already. And there's a number of other computational networks that are trying to do this. And then sort of like where we're headed long term, we have to bust the biggest bottleneck of all, which is chain bandwidth. So this is less a problem right now. But my prediction here is like it is easier to scale blockchains than to program off-chain things, like vastly easier. So my sense is we will get to very large-scale scalable blockchains through hierarchy. And there's a team already, one of the labs in NPL is building this consensus lab. And this will come to upgrade the consensus of Filecoin over time. So yeah, this is less relevant now, but important long-term. Developer ecosystem. So lots of like really awesome stats and use cases, lots of applications being built, lots of important use cases. The NFT stuff is like, I think, super interesting because all of that data is going to add all kinds of other important computational stuff. And everything that's happening around JPEGs right now is going to happen to large-scale video later. And it's just not happening to video right now because the tools aren't there. We don't have those good onboarding pathways. But once those are there, we can then see all kind of like systems develop around that. Yeah, awesome growth from NFT storage. Yeah, this is one of the things that we're like, I think this is going to be really cool, where video and whole virtual worlds are going to be able to kind of use the NFT tooling to pay all the artists around the world making these things, because, hey, it's really expensive to produce really high-quality art. And then all kinds of economic flows will be be built on top of this. A cool group to watch is Mona. Like they're came through. It's a great like Filecoin success story where like they went through one of the accelerators, I think Tachyon maybe, if I'm, and then has over time like grown with the network and are scaling. And so over time we can get to like building an open metaverse environment. And so think of building this in layers where you first get all of the data, you then add programmability, you add the coordination tooling through things like NFTs or other protocols, and so on. I think like teams that like have some, I think right now doing this at large scale is difficult. So teams should like focus on specific use cases and try to build composability. So one of the things that I think is promising about Mona is like they're focused on the composability of the rooms and enabling the rooms themselves to be created by artists who then make significant amounts of money by creating these rooms and selling them. But then once you have those rooms, you can enhance those with programmability and different kinds of games or different kinds of systems on top of that. So it's like a really good way of like decomposing what traditionally has been like a fully vertically integrated thing within like a large video game publisher. But now you can start creating, if you decompose that, you can create a whole decentralized economy in this environment. So yeah, over time, like this graph is a good one to watch. Of like, think of all the companies and startups building around our ecosystem. Cool. Sorry, I'm like running out of steam, so I'm gonna like conclude quickly. So for devs, like I think hackathons are really cool and valuable. For SPs, if you want to kind of accelerate the use cases, consider hosting an event and consider hosting hackathons around your communities. So we have SPs everywhere. if you host things like Phil Austin or Phil Toronto that is going to be hosted soon and so on, this can really help accelerate the development of applications. And then beyond that, think of also leaning into projects like Radius that enable large-scale problems to be solved by putting up Filecoin as bounties. So there's a lot of kind of gig work that's going to be enabled through tools like this. Cool. I mentioned something briefly about public goods because this might help solve some of the coordination challenges. The public goods ecosystem is, by the way, let me know on timing. Am I like, I'm probably running like way late. Am I 1 hour in? Great, so we have 30 more minutes, is that true? Yes. Okay, cool, great. So the whole public goods ecosystem, raise your hands if you like have heard about this stuff and like vaguely, a little bit, okay, cool. So this whole ecosystem is about using coordination primitives to organize large groups of people and organizations to build things that are valuable to those communities. And so you're usually kind of bringing together a set of participants, coordinating them through a mechanism to produce some like valuable components for them. Blockchains in general are public goods ecosystem. You're creating the public good of this transactional network that you're going to run, and you're coordinating through the mechanisms of block rewards and incentive structures and whatnot. But there's a whole, there's many more like families of protocols that are available, and I think right now we're like in a field building stage where it is now suddenly possible to couple all of the deep work that we've done on game theory and economics and mechanism design and so on with like public blockchains. And we're just seeing the very beginnings of that, like the Bitcoin block reward, Ethereum's EVM with the kind of gas model, and Filecoin with all of that plus the storage layer is like small examples of using these kinds of primitives and pushing them out into the world. There's a lot that's possible here. And at the moment, we need a lot of people to kind of help design these kinds of systems. And over time, we can get to solving super large problems. I sort of expect that we'll get to a point where we can define SLAs, like service level agreements, and attach funding to those SLAs through a public mechanism and have that coordinate large groups of people and organizations against that, meeting that SLA. At the end of the day, like this is how large corporations work. You can like sort of look at large corporations, squint and to just see how they coordinate, and then create public versions of those mechanisms in these networks. You'll have to tweak them. You'll have to like make sure that it makes sense. But if you do that kind of stuff, then you can create a very, very like powerful commons-oriented environment. So I think it's like super promising, but it's very early. So I think things like impact evaluators, grants, milestone bounties are like early examples. Many like new public funding mechanisms will emerge. The Ethereum community is really into this. Gitcoin is really into this. Optimus is really into this. There's a great talk that Pooja gave about like many different kinds of incentives around maintenance. That kind of stuff is really important. Think of all the software we're building. Incentivizing ongoing maintenance is valuable. Yeah, all kinds of like really useful mechanisms. There's also kind of like funding deployment. And yeah, like I think one that's like so early that I don't even have a good graph for this yet. My sense is like you can create a KPI and then have an impact evaluator releasing value against that KPI and have a public auction and just kind of like let that run. And then you have like maximization of that KPI. A trivial example of this is the Bitcoin hash rate auction, right? So the Bitcoin network is really like a currency that built on top of this crazy hash rate auction system, where like at every round, it's just gonna auction off a certain amount of Bitcoin for whoever presents, a ton of hash rate. And it's like very, very simple. It doesn't have like many other mechanisms. And that has created one of the largest consumers of energy on the planet, like in like a decade, right? It went from nothing to, a decade and a half, I guess. And so that's the power of these kinds of systems, of an open, permissionless, guaranteed impact evaluator against a KPI. It's just like, let's pick some good impact, because getting more SHA-256 hashers to like dissipate energy is probably not the best use. Think of like the Filecoin block reward as associated with like building out capacity and now building out useful data storage through Filecoin Plus. But there are many other KPIs that we want to be able to like incentivize. So think of once FVM lands, being able to run these kinds of like public auction things where if you have a good way of verifiably testing that people are showing up with some resource or some value created or some impact, then just rewarding them proportionally. Auction mechanisms are super, super powerful because they just cut through a lot of the coordination bottlenecks. Like having a public, reliable auction that is an ongoing system and just so declared into the market is one of the fastest ways of getting large activity to happen. So supply chains work this way. The Google ad model works this way. All kinds of systems are based on auctions. Cool. And yeah, there's a conference coming up in a couple weeks about this kind of these mechanisms. So maybe see you there. Probably want to talk a little bit about macroeconomic climate because it's very much in the air on a lot of conversations and so on. I covered a lot of this in the AMA last week, but I want to touch a little bit on the world economy, crypto, and then Filecoin. So everyone's probably tired of like seeing this, but like the macro economy is like not doing great. Everyone's freaking out. But in context, like it's kind of hard to like. We had just an insane level of growth over the last 2 years, and certainly the last decade. So in context, like this kind of makes sense. One important thing to notice, though, if you like go and plot out the numbers, I don't think we're at the bottom yet. So it could either go sideways, we could have like another V-shaped recovery, or it could go down a lot more. So like in this climate, you want to be careful. You want to be like make sure that you have good. The only cost here, and you can see tons of people over decades talking about this, the only problem here is, or like the main problem for businesses, is being able to raise capital. So if you don't need to raise capital, or you don't need to raise a lot, then this doesn't impact you very much. And so I think like this is where like you want to be careful with like liquidity management. You want to be careful with cash reserves and so on. But if you're really well poised, then this can be one of the best moments for growth for you. In the crypto world, like same kind of thing. Everyone's like, "Oh, crypto is dead." Like every cycle, we hear the same thing. Really think of like crypto in terms of like I think it doesn't make sense to look at it in kind of like the absolute value. If you look at it in the log scale and over many years, like that's how you can see like the crypto's growth over time. It's kind of in some measures kind of crazy, but at the end of the day, like you want to be able to kind of deal with the cyclicality. By the way, there's a lot in Bitcoin itself that causes the cyclicality. When you have a peak in Bitcoin and then you have like a crash, and then a lot of hash rate disappears, then a lot of Bitcoin starts being sold for less value, because that's effectively what the auction model is doing. And so my guess is that the auction model of Bitcoin itself and a hash rate drop is contributing to like the long recovery of Bitcoin. And unfortunately, the rest of the crypto space is sort of pegged to Bitcoin at the moment. It'll probably take a few years to get unpegged against that. And so we are like, all of the rest of the crypto world sort of like swings with Bitcoin, which is great when it is going up, but like bad when it's coming down. The other thing to mention here is like, remember how like volatile the crypto space is? Like this is Ethereum in the 2017 cycle. Like it went from 85 to 1400-ish, and then back down to 85 in the span of like a year. It's a lot, right? And look at Ethereum today. Look at ETH now and like massive growth and tons of applications and so on. Other point here is like the last cycle, things went down a lot more. This cycle we're not yet at that bottom, and that last cycle was during like a private equities boom, not a private equities crash. So it's really unclear what's going to happen, but we might see like lows even further or not, right? So it's one of these things where like the best thing you can do is be prepared for all three outcomes, like things crashing further, things becoming stable and choppy for like a while, or things recovering and booming again. And what you don't want to do is get into a position where it's very difficult to maneuver, where you sort of commit to one bet, and it's very difficult to adjust if the market turns out to be something different. So acknowledge that there's at least 3 different things that could happen, or 3 families of things that could happen, and know that even like you don't have a 50-50 bet. If you bet on one of those things, you're most likely wrong. And so just be prepared for all outcomes, and really lean into like good stable growth. Again, financial stability and then good stable growth. And yeah, Bitcoin was kind of like interesting in the last cycle. By the way, Paradigm, the whole fund, like return its first fund through that low. Cool. So as a whole crypto world says, like this is the time to build. So for SPs, like here's like a focus areas. Stable operations. So managed cash flows in this downturn really ensure survival. So this like really matters. It's not clear what the macroecon condition will be like 6 months from now. Could be worse, could be way better. But you definitely want to take a look. This is like a good moment to pause, take a look at your operations, look ahead, and try to get to a point where you have like good runway. This is a good moment to like think about growth. Make sure you're really well positioned and grow in the areas that you can without accumulating a lot of risk. So think of like things that compound. Think about joining forces. If like things are like difficult and so on, look to other friendly SPs that you've had like really good work relationships and see if like there's some cost cutting that you can do together or something. This redoubles the importance of Filecoin Plus. And so now that we've sort of like prototyped that program and it's shown like really high success, leaning into it to orient towards really important outcomes in the network, like public data, retrievability, and so on, that might be like a super successful way of like helping the entire community kind of like deal with this cycle while investing deeply into improving the operations for the network, right? So if we can like come out of this downturn with like massive scale public data, computability around that, and fast retrieval, like for like all public data commons, and the first data DAOs exploring like all this data, like that'd be a phenomenal place to be. And I really think that Filecoin Plus is such a cool system. It can achieve those kinds of things, but it really sort of requires your participation to like help drive that program in different directions to make sure that it's like a good structure for the whole network. So think of like broader participation in like think of like the reward structures and so on. I don't know if this was discussed earlier today, but over time a lot of people have been talking about like Filecoin Plus potentially having multiple different reward tiers as opposed to just a single one for different kinds of operations. Like if you bring in private data, that's rewarded the same amount. If you bring in public data, which is more valuable to the network, then that's a different amount and so on. And as I mentioned before, like this is an important part where like if there's like good secondary business models there, lean into them. Like you want to kind of, as you're creating value and so on, lean into secondary business models to augment your cash flow operations. Any questions here, by the way? Like I'm sure this is like important and tough on your minds and so on. This is like a good, other than the fact that this is live streamed to the world, this is a small room. Maybe we pause the live stream later. Yeah, so touching a bit on the economics and so on. Here, these are like really good graphs. Thanks to the Starboard team for putting all of these things together. It's like super valuable for the network to be able to look at these kinds of data. And over time, this will kind of improve. It'd be really awesome to see the new committed deals in terabytes and be able to segment that out by region, by use case, by specific client or something like that, to be able to like see what things are like working really well and kind of grow from those. Yeah, getting, oh yeah, and somebody asked me about like why 5 petabytes and so on. If you look back to the sector onboarding breakdown here, kind of like these graphs are sort of stacked to see kind of like the Filecoin locked and burnt as % of circulating supply. The network wants to be in kind of like the 80% range. That's sort of like where sort of like the parameters are designed to be. And you hit that with like that onboarding rate, like the 50, 60 petabyte scale of onboarding, which is the same as 5 petabytes of Filecoin Plus, right? Like that's about the same amount of collateral ratios. And so that's why hitting 5 petabytes a day can be, is really good for the network. Plus 5 petabytes a day of really valuable public data is like a great way to get Filecoin to be the largest scale storage network storing humanity's most valuable data, right? So this is like a really good alignment of incentives here where like the goal of what the network wants to hit plus the broader economic structures and so on kind of orient towards that pathway. But to hit 5 petabytes a day, we really need to lean into those data onboarding pipelines that are kind of offline. We need to improve the links and so on. Cool. And if there's probably a lot that we can discuss here in the Crypto Econ Day. So if you want to dive in deep into this and kind of understand more about the mechanisms and so on, that'll be a good time. And ZX and a number of the Crypto Econ folks will be there, so you can like dig into a bunch of questions. Cool. So last few slides. Yeah, I think like let's get to large-scale onboarding rates, 6 petabytes of Falcon Plus deals. So more than capacity, like capacity is great, but like valuable data is way better. So let's aim for that as a community. Like we should be focusing on onboarding really valuable use cases. And that really translates into making sure that the current pilots go really well, and then that you bootstrap success case of those pilots into something bigger. Great, and last comments for startups and developers, same kind of thing, stable operations, funding, get to profitability. And if you're just an individual contributor to the community, there's tons of people hiring through this period. Like large companies are in the tech world are doing hiring freezes. Most of the groups that I know around the Falcon ecosystem and crypto are all hiring and growing. So this is a great time to like hop over from those environments to this one. And you can also find a lot of gig work through things like Radius. Last thing, good opportunities to hang out with us. Like in the past, we've had the Bangalore build space in India, which I heard was amazing. I really hope to go there sometime, either this year or next. Orbit Falcon in Lagos. The Sustainable Blockchain Summit. I think there's another one coming up. This is, by the way, this is one of the I've gotten a ton of like really positive attention and comments about this kind of stuff. The fact that Falcon can be the first fully green storage network is a huge deal. No other storage network on the planet is quite doing this. So we can sort of like beat the rest of the world to this, and we can show how it's done, and you can show how like you can decarbonize the planet. This will be super, super valuable as a success case. I think finding ways of like there might be a way of connecting the whole Falcon Green rec thing to like government subsidies for green energy. And like that might be like a super good flow of like bringing economic activity into the Falcon network for doing all this, like giving credit to the Falcon network for doing all this valuable work. ETH Amsterdam was pretty awesome. Lots of hacking going on, Paris P2P and so on. We're now in Austin. Tons of events happening this week. Huge thank you to the Falcon Foundation for organizing all of this. Like huge undertaking, so thank you. And lots of stuff going on. And ahead, I think we have Phil Toronto, is that right? Charles? Awesome. 4th to 6th. HackFest is an online hackathon. The IPFS thing is like a gathering in Nordic, in like Old German and so on. This is for like a set of workshops around IPFS implementations. Then Falcon Singapore in August, and I think a lot of stuff in Lisbon later on in the year.
So this is less a question, but I'm trying to recalibrate my comprehension of the world. And so I would consider myself a storage enabler, not so much a storage provider. And but I have worked on a number of big KVS systems, and I'm familiar with how DNS and all that stuff works. The indexer, in terms of the retrieval providers and stuff like that, that's a super critical role, I think, in helping us reach critical mass in terms of functionality. But I've looked at the indexer code, and I don't see anything that is intrinsically self-balancing about it that allows it to scale. So what I'm actually looking for is a self-balancing hierarchy where the indexers, by way of hash allocations or something like that, yeah, you targeted 10 millisecond retrieval time from the indexers to identify where the content, which providers are providing the content. We can't expect that from big blobs and whatnot. And then I've got a part 2 question that follows on with that. So is there a plan to get the indexers cooperating in an ad hoc type network type thing and rebalancing themselves so that we could, like a DNS tree traversal, we can get to the sub block?
Yep. 2 things here. One is we're coming from running a large-scale DHT in IPFS, which deals with like all these problems when you're setting up new connections. And we're trying to move into a spot where we can do really high throughput retrieval of records by leaning into less machines. One of the kind of important pieces here is that for most applications and so on, you can fit all of the provider records. Like, it turns out that now we have a lot of storage and a lot of machines. So you can fit a vast amount of records for large-scale applications into single machines, like single, say, petabyte machines. And then you can replicate the entire thing and then just serve like read-only copies of that. So that's one insight. The second insight is there are like straightforward distributed systems algorithms to do that kind of sharding and so on, and we can lean into that at some point. I think like the Indexer team is already kind of planning for that and kind of going in that direction. But right now, just getting this structure to scale and just make the big bottleneck right now is latency of retrieval is not dealing with too large of a scale for an indexer. And so you can end up, you think of like ending at a spot where we have the same index replicated across a bunch of regions, and over time, as people add to that index, that diffuses through that sort of that network. The other thread here is that once we have, it's sort of like privacy preserving indices. So today, most distributed systems like this, especially in peer-to-peer and certainly in blockchains, are public. Like you can observe the who's writing the index, and you can observe who's reading the index. And so that's an important privacy concern. You want to get to a point where all operations on these things are fully private. And doing that is going to require other protocols that then where most of these protocols tend to not be distributed in nature. They tend to think of having a large part of the index all in the same effective system or effective computer. And so there are many different cryptographic structures for doing this kind of privacy-preserving indexing. And those add about like a log n factor to the lookup. Because you have to, when you do a query, you have to like touch a bunch of parts of the memory to hide the access. So I think like just thinking about storage density rates and the fact that you want things in close proximity, we will likely end up with like a tree structure, but that tree doesn't have to be very deep. It might be that it's just one layer deep because there is a lot of hardware now. You can get these like petabyte scale indices and just lean on machines like that. So you can sort of expect that the indices will be large, but you have full copies of those or close to fresh full copies in a bunch of regions, and then be able to sort of scale that way. So that's the current bottleneck is around retrievability of a lot of records, and so let's solve that problem first, and then later we can upgrade into adding the sharding to those indices. There's also another bet here, which is that consensus scaling thing that I described earlier with hierarchical scaling, that might be able to apply to indexing too. You might be able to generate an index out of a network like that. So there's a lot of like multiple paths right now that are being explored, and we'll sort of see, say in a year, where the network is and what are the bottlenecks there. But I think the main problem right now is like throughput of the retrievability and being able to just store a lot of indices.
Second question, and it follows on with that. I see the indexers having an opportunity to monetize their role in the ecosystem, not unlike what Google AdWords does, but what an anonymized client base and anonymized data, but analyzing the traffic patterns on the network. And so I haven't seen anybody plot a course on that where there's a secondary benefit to being an effective indexer in the world, because now you've got relationships between consumers and producers and holders of content. The last part is on the retrieval providers. And you mentioned on every single one of your punchline slides, you listed the opportunities and whatnot. And I have a vision of specialized retrieval providers, either in, like, say, an NFT content, but they become a portal to application-specific domains. And I just wanted to bench check that. I was reading that between the lines that the RPs in the generic context, as we're bootstrapping this, serve one role, but they might become the, in effect, like a GitHub of the FC network is a specialized kind of retrieval provider.
Yep, that's a great point. So maybe I'll first talk about the indexers. You're totally right that can be monetized, and there could be an incentivized protocol there to incentivize indexers to exist. I think incentivizing indexing in the clear is probably both not necessary in that like it's not that expensive to run these indices, and I would rather kind of incentivize the privacy preserving ones once we figure them out. So, but I do think that like once FVM is out, probably people will try this and they will have really fast, comprehensive indices that maybe you pay with Filecoin to like access or something like that. Or there might be L2s. People might generate this as an L2 network. However, I think like and part of that we've for many years talked about like, oh, you can do an incentivized DHT, and you can have like really large DHT nodes, and you can solve most of the problems that DHTs have by having these large-scale nodes, a much smaller DHT, and so on. So you can follow that trajectory. And that does make a lot of sense, and I think it's the space is open for that. But I think given the problems that these indexers have, solving the privacy-preserving ones, where you have read and writer privacy fully, is a really important component. And I think once things get incentivized, it's difficult to like change the trajectory too much. And especially adding privacy-preserving components to it will be a much harder change. So I would rather like use the public and the clear indexes as a stepping stone while we solve the privacy-preserving indices to then kind of incentivize those. And those will need more storage and more computation. So there's an even stronger argument as to why you really need to incentivize those. With the added caveat that like, be careful incentivizing privacy-preserving things because like you want to be, there's constraints there. The second point on the RP networks, absolutely right. I think like there'll be first some generic RP systems, but delivering super high quality UX for specific verticals might mean that there are some special case ones. So a video CDN functions very differently than a static asset, like a code CDN, and that functions very differently than a Docker container CDN, where you can assume that you can deduplicate tons of the underlying content. So yeah, I think that those might end up differentiating, but it's likely that the primitives are much closer, and so that one network that does more might work. This is a little bit different from the decentralized computation one, because the decentralized computation one, the differences there are super deep. Like the differences in the architecture of the cryptographic protocols, or how you compose those, or how you incentivize those, you end up with like generating completely different techniques, and which you might wrap into one product, which is which is difficult. And so that's why I think in that case, like we'll definitely see different networks. In the RP case, we might see both. We might see some special case ones, and then some generic ones that work for like most of the cases. So maybe like a good strategy might be go for a generic one, and then in those specific verticals where like a differentiated UX really matters, maybe at that point create one of those. So like video is a good one.